Now, many of you will know that CRT is going to take a trip to Prague and Vienna in the fall, and a number of people have signed up from here and delighted that we'll be taking this journey together. So I wanted to share a story about something that comes out of Prague that I think is a fascinating story and has an important message for us. Many synagogues have a torah in the foyer or somewhere near the front of the sanctuary in a glass case. These so-called Holocaust torahs have been distributed throughout the world, and their history is fascinating. The people who prayed with these Torah scrolls tragically met their deaths at the hands of the Nazis. We need to understand the full story of these Torah scrolls in order to fully understand the people behind them. Here you can see a Torah scroll at Temple Emmanuel in Newton. Underneath the Torah scroll is an inscription. The inscription reads, "This sacred Torah scroll was read in a synagogue in Dvor Králové, Czechoslovakia, until June 1942, when the Nazis deported the entire Jewish community to Theresienstadt. By the end of World War II, the Nazis had murdered nearly all of Czechoslovakian Jewry, some 350,000 people in Birkenau, Belzec, and other death camps. Only 44,000 Czech Jews survived the war. The Sefer Torah, however, escaped destruction because, as it says here, the Nazis confiscated it, intending to display it in their diabolically conceived Central Museum of the Extinguished Jewish Race in Prague. It remained there until 1963, when the local authorities gave permission for its transfer, along with 1,563 other Torah scrolls, to the Westminster Synagogue in London. Now, this inscription, which is a common one in many synagogues that have these Torah scrolls, is incorrect. The survival of these Torah scrolls was not due to the hands of the Nazis. There is no evidence of a Nazi museum of the extinguished Jewish race. And all of these Torah scrolls come from two regions in the Czech Republic. So we need to understand something about the nature of what was happening in the Czech Republic and in Prague in order to understand the story of these Torah scrolls. Czechoslovakia only really became a country after the First World War, and it had three distinct provinces: Moravia, Bohemia, and Slovakia. Today, these two have been divided so that Slovakia is a separate country and the Czech lands are in the west. Bohemia and Moravia had long-standing Jewish communities which had been there for centuries. And unusually, many of them were in the countryside. They were rural synagogues in small villages and towns. The only really main center of Jewish life in this region was Prague, the capital. And that's where the oldest Jewish synagogue in Europe resided, which is the Altneu Shul. It is the oldest existing shul in Europe, and we will see it when we go to Prague. Here, there was an established Jewish community, and there were many synagogues nearby in the center of Prague. These synagogues have now all been turned into what has become the Jewish Museum in Prague. So we might ask the question, how did 1,500 Torah scrolls from these small rural communities of Moravia and Bohemia turn up in Prague, and that they are the only existing Torah scrolls that are left in Europe from that time? All other Torah scrolls in Germany, in other parts of occupied Nazi Europe, were destroyed by the Nazis. The story of these Torah scrolls has only recently come to light in the last 10 years. And it is through these documents that I'm about to show you that we learn the true story of what was happening in Prague in 1942. This is a letter in German and in Czech, and it's dated Prague, the 28th of May, 1942. It comes from the Jewish Kulturgemeinde in Prague, the Jewish cultural community, the Jewish community in Prague. And it is a letter written to all of the rural synagogues in Moravia and Bohemia, asking them to crate up all of their Jewish artifacts in the synagogue, including the Torah scrolls, and to send them to a depot or a postal location where they could be forwarded on to the Jewish Museum in Prague. This record of a request by the Prague Jewish Museum to call in, if you like, all of the artifacts from these communities was a recognition that these synagogues and the people would not survive the war. As Jewish communities were being transported away to the death camps, the leaders of the Jewish community recognized that the only way to preserve Jewish life was to keep intact the objects that were part of Jewish living and existence. And so here we are in the middle of the Second World War in May 1942, where Jewish communities are taking their materials, crating them up, and sending them to Prague at the bequest of the Jewish community. Here we have a photograph from 1942, from Prague, from the Jewish Museum, and you will see here workers unpacking the crates. If you look carefully, you'll see a menorah down here. You'll see books, a mantle, which is probably a paroquet, that means a Torah cover, from the front of an ark. There is a scroll here, more books, and they are all being recorded by the workers who receive these crates, and you'll see their crates behind, all numbered and labeled. The letter and this work demonstrates that the Jewish community believed that it was important to keep a record and a safe collection of the materials that the Jewish community could no longer handle in their rural villages and towns. Over 250,000 items came to Prague in 1942, sent by the Jewish communities. Here is another original photograph from 1942. You will see here two women, and they have Jewish stars on their coats, indicating that they were working as Jews in this area where this material was being collected. You'll see here there is lots of linen. These could be Shabbat tablecloths, challah cloths, all kinds of material from the Jewish communities in these regions. If you look at the top of the photograph, you will see that there are organ pipes. So what we note from this is that there was so much that was brought into Prague that gradually the synagogues in the center of Prague were turned into repositories for all this material. And gradually these synagogues, which of course were now closed, were no longer open for services, and of course there were very few Jews left. These synagogues were now being used to store this material. As long as the material was coming in and it was being documented and recorded, these workers were being protected. They were considered essential workers, and they were even paid a salary for doing this work. All of this under the eyes, of course, the Nazis, who were the occupiers of Prague in 1942. But the Nazis had no involvement in this work. It was almost as if they turned a blind eye to what was happening. This is a photograph taken from the women's gallery of a synagogue, looking down into the atrium of a synagogue where hundreds of books, thousands of books were being collected, again, lovingly stored and catalogued as part of this Jewish collection. Of the 250,000 items that were delivered to Prague, over 1,500 were Torah scrolls. Many of these Torah scrolls came from these rural villages and towns, and they were recorded from where they came and from who donated them to the synagogue. When they came to the collection point, the mantles were removed and they were stored with tags in order to indicate where they had come from. They were stored carefully. Some of them had numbers painted onto their rollers, the wooden rollers, and the Torah covers were kept in a separate place. Now, this is where an individual, if I might say, a Jewish hero, comes into the picture. His name was Joseph Pollack. Here is a picture of him as a young man. He was born in Prague, and he became a museum director. He invented a new system of cataloging cultural items that was more than just ancient museum pieces, but more folk art and cultural pieces that had been part of the Prague Jewish Museum before the war. It was his system that allowed the 250,000 items to be catalogued and kept in order with a record of where they came from. He was also a photographer, and he was one of the very first in the world to photograph every single item that came into the museum and believed in the importance of photography in museum work. We have here something that is, the original is now in the Prague Jewish Museum and was not found until the 1980s. Oh, sorry, that's a picture of him as an older man. And this would have been around the time of the 1940s with his son. And a picture of him near his death in 1943 when he was sent to Auschwitz. But this is the record card that he invented that describes every single item that came into the museum. You'll see at the top here in German, it says Torah mantle. It has the color. It has a description of what would have been on the front of the Torah mantle, the Torah cover. It has an inscription as a dedication. As we know, many Torah covers have a dedication. And here the dedication is from Shire, the wife of Elijah Werner from 1872. It is given here the dimensions of the Torah, the day in which the date in which the Torah mantle was made, 1872. And down here in the right-hand corner, you'll see the initials PK, and that is for his name, Joseph Pollack. Every item was recorded in this way, and the book of these record cards has now been discovered and is in the Prague Jewish Museum, which I'm hoping we will see when we go to Prague. What is even more fascinating was the fact that Joseph Pollack put on exhibitions of Jewish Judaica, Jewish art, inside the synagogues from 1942 to 1943. You will see here a picture, again, original from the time, of a synagogue building. Here's the women's gallery. Here's the ark in the front. But if you look on the sides, where the seats would normally be, they have installed almost semi-permanent wooden exhibition centers in which there are hanging Torah mantles that would have covered the arks in the various different synagogues around Moravia and Bohemia. And these exhibitions would have been open for people to come and see them. You see here an individual holding a Torah scroll up high in front of the ark. We call this Hagbah, the ritual of holding the open Torah after the Torah reading. In fact, this is not a person. This is a wax effigy of an individual as part of the exhibition that Joseph Pollack organized. Here you see from another angle these Torah mantles hanging, and in these glass cases in the front, these are the yad, the Torah pointers that would have come from all the different Torahs that would have been part of the exhibition. You might ask, what was happening in Prague that would give him any kind of indication that it was worth putting on an exhibition of Jewish life in the synagogues as part of the Jewish Museum? Well, we don't exactly know the reason, but part of the reason, we believe, may have been to keep the workers busy, because as long as the Jewish workers were involved in work organized by the Jewish Museum, they were safe and protected from the Nazis. The moment that this work ended was the moment that they were rounded up and sent to Auschwitz. And tragically, none of the workers survived who had worked on this exhibition or had worked on these Torah scrolls in Prague from 1942 onwards. So we have no oral accounts of what was happening at that time. We only have these photographs and the records of the museum, which, as I say, were found only very recently. This is a postcard from Joseph Pollack to his wife. This is from Theresienstadt concentration camp. Again, we will be visiting Theresienstadt as part of our journey. You'll see that it's written to Irina Polakova. She actually was not Jewish, so she was protected. She was not sent away, and neither was her son, Joseph Pollack's son. So his son and his wife survived, but he was sent to Theresienstadt, and this postcard tells her not to send any parcels to him because he was about to be moved, and he was moved to Auschwitz. This is dated the 2nd of November 1942. The story continues with the Torah scrolls. Now, as you know, after the war, Czechoslovakia fell to the Russians. The Russians kept the countries of the East behind an iron wall, the Iron Curtain, and the Torah scrolls were kept in a warehouse in Prague. They were wrapped in plastic, as you can see here. So this is a photograph from after the war. Now, Torah scrolls are organic, meaning everything about them is natural. The parchment, the ink, the wooden rollers. Nothing about them is man-made. So to wrap them in plastic is to deny them the air they need in order to continue to have a clear and a healthy life. Wrapping them in plastic by those in charge in the communist era, of which there were no Jews, meant that they were just going to deteriorate. And the communists, who had no interest in keeping them in any kind of environmentally suitable environment, let them deteriorate. And so by the 1960s, they had pretty much deteriorated in a big fashion. They had been in a damp warehouse, and these 1,500 Torah scrolls were just lumped together, covered in this plastic. It's at this point that an American art dealer living in London came to learn about the story of the Torah scrolls in Prague. And he came to Prague, he saw them, he was horrified in the state they were in, and he offered to buy them. The communist government in the 1960s in Czechoslovakia was very keen to have hard American currency. So they accepted the currency and they transported 1,500 Torah scrolls to London, where he was living. And he arranged with a local synagogue in London, the Westminster Synagogue, that they would all reside in the synagogue for the time being. The rabbi of that synagogue, Rabbi Reinhardt, was a refugee from Nazi Germany, now serving in London as a rabbi. And of course, it was very moving for him to now be the repository and the holder of a very important collection of Torah scrolls. These Torah scrolls came, as they are looking in this picture, wrapped in binders, but without their Torah covers. The binders, however, were of their own merit. Each binder had the names of the children embroidered from that community. This was a Czech tradition that these binders, in Yiddish called wimpel, had the names of the children of the community embroidered on them, with beautiful embroidery and illustrations that were made by the women of the community, and then wrapped around the Torah scroll, often used at the bar mitzvah or the bat mitzvah of the children of the community. Each one is different, and each one is particularly beautiful. The Czech government in the 1960s had not realized that the binders were still on the Torah scrolls, and they in fact sued the art dealer to get them back because they realized they were quite valuable, but they were never returned. And so today, if you go to Westminster Synagogue in London, and I'm sure some of you have been, you will go to a small museum on the top floor of the synagogue in which these Torah binders are kept. And you will see here they're rolled on shelves, but also you'll see the long shelves here. And if you pull these shelves out, they are unwrapped, and you can see the names of the children of the communities, all recorded by Joseph Pollack. The story comes to its conclusion in 1964 when an itinerant Torah scribe by the name of David Brand knocked on the door of the London synagogue. Rabbi Reinhardt, the rabbi of the synagogue, opened the door, and David Brand said to Rabbi Reinhardt, "I'm an itinerant Torah scroll repairer. I've been going around synagogues in London. I wonder if you have any Torah scrolls that I could fix for you." David Brand stayed at Westminster Synagogue for 25 years, fixing and repairing 1,500 Torah scrolls. It was obviously a life's work, and he is remembered particularly with fondness by all those who have been involved in this story. Today, if you go to Westminster Synagogue, you'll see this exhibition. It's only a small part, a remnant of what was there in the 1960s. For all of the repaired Torah scrolls that could be used were sent out to communities across the world, United States, Canada, all the Commonwealth countries, South Africa, Australia, and also to emerging Jewish communities in Europe, back to Germany, to France, to Holland, and even some back to Czechoslovakia. When the scrolls that David Brand could no longer repair were found, then they were offered to communities and placed into glass cases like this one here and the one at Temple Emmanuel in Newton, and there's also one at Temple Reim in Newton. These ones are not able to be read because they're damaged in some way, but they are kept and remembered as part of the Czech Memorial Scroll Trust. They continue to be owned by Westminster Synagogue in London, and they are on lifetime loan to any synagogue who wants them. When the synagogue comes to the end of its life, or the synagogue closes or merges, the Torah scroll has to be returned to Westminster Synagogue, when it is then sent again to another synagogue. Every Torah scroll comes with a record of where it came from, the small community in Bohemia or Moravia, and the people, if we know them, who lived and died living with this particular Torah scroll. And that's the story of the Czech Torah scrolls. I want to say one last thing about them. Rather than being a story of victimization, rather than being a story about how the Nazis treated us, this is a story about how Jews struggled for resistance and survival, and how they took into their own hands the important legacy of preserving Jewish life. Joseph Pollack and all those who worked with him, who we do not know their names, stayed in Prague to ensure that we would have this legacy and that we would ensure that we could take this story, know it, and pass it on, and make sure that the Torah scroll remains an important and compelling and vital part of our Jewish lives. Amen. We have our anthem, which is Ani Ma'amin, the song that was sung by many of the victims of the Holocaust. I will believe, even though God is not present.